Well, one of my favorite characters and people and stories in the Bible is the story of Jacob. And Jacob is this incredibly interesting person in the Bible because his story is one of betrayal and lies and deceit and all kinds of sin and brokenness. And it's also a story that reveals God's love for his people, God's unfailing love and kindness and grace towards his people. No matter how much we mess up, no matter how much brokenness we cause, no matter how much sin we commit, that he is still faithful to his promises for his people. And one of the most famous stories about Jacob is to do with his sons, especially his son named Joseph. Joseph, who is betrayed by his brothers and thrown into the pit and then thrown into slavery and sold off to the Egyptians. And then after the famine happens and Joseph goes through all of these things where God miraculously provides for him, Jacob and his other sons end up having to go to Egypt and face Joseph because they are in need of food because of the great famine. And while it takes a while for them to figure out that Joseph is their brother, that this man that is in charge of Egypt and of all the food and all the land of Egypt is their brother, once they realize it and Joseph and his brothers reconcile, they begin to bring their father Jacob to Egypt to meet him. And near the end of Jacob's life, there is this ceremony where he goes and he blesses his sons, and then he blesses Joseph's sons as well and brings them into being part of the 12 tribes of Israel. But there's this incredibly beautiful statement that Jacob makes at the end of his life to Joseph. And it's one of those things where we can read over it really quickly, but I believe it reveals an incredibly profound truth about who our God is. And so at the end of his life, Jacob, who goes by his name that was given to him by God, Israel, says this. It says in Genesis chapter 48, verse 11, Israel said to Joseph, "I never expected to see your face again, but now God has even let me see your children." And so there's this promise of hope and restoration that we see here because Jacob has gone through this life of all kinds of sin and deceit and lies and betrayal and all kinds of family dysfunction. And in his mind, Joseph is gone forever. There is no hope of ever seeing his son Joseph again. And when he finds out that Joseph's alive, there's this doubt in his mind of, is there even going to be reconciliation with Joseph? Will I really get to embrace him as my son again? And so Jacob says this reality of his heart when he says, I never even expected to see Joseph again. I never got to expect to see you again. And that's what sin and brokenness and life do to us, right? They beat us up, they wear us down, our hearts become heavy with all kinds of burdens. To the point where we just look at our lives, we look at the world and we go, I don't expect good things. I don't expect healing, I don't expect reconciliation, I don't expect hope and renewal. Much like Jacob just expected Joseph to be dead, to never see him again. But Jacob reveals the heart of our God, the goodness of our God when he says, but now even God has let me see your children. That Jacob got to see his grandchildren from Joseph. Because our God is a God of restoration and renewal and reconciliation and hope. And through Jesus Christ, our God is a God of resurrection. So that when we look at our lives, when we look at the world and all the pain and the hurt and the brokenness and the sin, and we feel overwhelmed and we feel like despairing and saying, I'm never going to see goodness again, I'm never going to see hope again, I'm never going to see reconciliation again, we know that those things don't get the last word, that they are not how the story ends. Because the story ends with Jesus rising from the dead. The story ends with Jesus returning to restore all things, to wipe away all tears, and to heal all things. So that when we put our faith in Jesus, we know that God does more than we ever expected. More than anything we could ever hope for. Because at the end of all things, Jesus heals everything. And he wipes away every tear. So that when we look and we say, I never expected any of this, we get to rejoice like Jacob and say, but God has done more than I expected. So my hope and prayer for you is that you would see and believe in the God of Jacob. A God who restores and heals and reconciles. A God of hope and resurrection. God's peace to you.